All right, so we're going to start by talking about federalism today, and I want somebody to remind me. No, you can't remind me because you didn't do it at all. So here, I'll just tell you. The definition of federalism is, you're going to write this down word for word. I know you're ready. The definition of federalism is, you're all right with you, it is the sharing of power between the states and the national government.
We did that. We did.
Oh, good. The sharing of power between the states and the national government. But before we get too far into that, I want to show you a picture to make you confused.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Look at the picture. What are you noticing that is not part of our definition of federalism? Yeah, all of those 89,476 local governments, right? Which are not part of our definition here. There's a reason for that. Somebody remind me, in a federal form of government, how many sources of sovereignty are there? There are two major sources of sovereignty, that's right. What are those two sources? The national government and the various states. That means who on this list does not have sovereignty? All those local governments, right? 89,470, whatever. That means, where do they get their authority? The states. So one of the things that's important for us to keep in mind is that in this federalism puzzle, lots of the things that we talk about as state powers are actually things that are done by local governments. But the reason we still consider them state powers is that officially the Constitution gives those powers to the states. The states just choose to pass them on. The next thing I want to get out of the way is this idea of who created the national government. And you might think this is really dumb because we have spent at least 5,000 hours talking about popular sovereignty as a social contract on your heads. You know what popular sovereignty is? Social contract is? Good. So we spent a long time, but here's the thing, you always have to fight a whole war in which like the equivalent of 5 million people died, right? The same proportion of the population that has been killed in the Civil War were to die today. 5 million people, right? This is a huge conflict that we fought. And the Civil War was required to decide this question. So I think it's worth a 30-second mention here in our AP government class. Here it is. So although some of the states believed that because they, what's that word that means accepted the Constitution? Because they ratified the Constitution, therefore they had created the national government. And that if they created it, then it would make sense that they have the rights to uncreate it or to withdraw from it. That's where the whole Civil War came in, right? But in fact, the Civil War resolved that question, and frankly speaking, the Constitution made it fairly clear with the first three words, which are, we the people, right? Who created the U.S. government? The people, right? That's the whole popular sovereignty business. Simultaneously, because of the social contract, we believe that the people created the authority of the state government as well. So the thing is, the people created both, the national governments and the states. And because of the way the Constitution is written, the people have given their authority to place the national government over the state government. And that's like not debatable anymore, right? So sorry all of you who have a Texas secedes bumper sticker on the back of your car. It is a poor plan. Even if we could, which we can't, we wouldn't want to because our economy would fall flat in approximately 25 seconds. So, there we go. Here's a cartoon to talk about some of the problems with federalism. This is from, came from after the Hurricane Katrina crisis that occurred, which we lamented in 5th period. I'm getting older while all my students say the same. You guys were tiny when this happened. But anyway, let's just go with the big hurricane. Okay, bad stuff happened. And part of the bad stuff was caused by the fact that nobody, not the national government, not the state government, not the local governments, was clear about what their job was. So everybody just assumed that it was somebody else's job to prepare for or respond to the various crises that occurred because of Hurricane Katrina. And if you just assume it's somebody else's job, how much of it got done? None of it, that's right. And so that made the crisis worse anyway. So this cartoon, despite all the destruction, one commodity was still arriving in New Orleans in great profusion: incompetence. The guy says, now is this vote federal, state, or local, right? Anyway, this helps to show us that part of the reason we need to study federalism is to really understand this pretty complicated web of sharing of powers, whose job is what, and so on. But another reason for this cartoon is to give me an opportunity to tell you or remind you that the storm, extra credit, is available to you. It's not due until like Friday the 23rd, which is the day of our exam. It's in Schoology. It's not a surprise. Many of you have already seen what this is and know about it. But In case you hadn't seen it in school, as you wanted to know, generally there are 2 extra credit opportunities every 6 weeks. One of them is the extra credit mini quiz, and then one of them is something else. Usually it'll be a video like this. But this 6 weeks we have a third, pretty tiny opportunity. But anyway, for Cake Day, Edible Models Day, right? That's next Wednesday, by the way. I'll see you one more time before Edible Models Day. But so this is that second opportunity, and I'll take the moment then to talk to you about how the extra credit works, because a lot of the stuff we do in this class is just a holdovers from the way that Mrs. Copa did it, because she's amazing and why that's a good thing. But it does take a little bit of explaining. So the way the extra credit points work, they're going to go in the academic practice or like daily grade category. And sometimes students see that and they go like, oh, that's lame, not worth anything, I'm not going to do it. But it actually is worth something, and I want to show you how. So you guys know that your average is figured out by 80% of your academic achievement grades and 20% of academic progress grades. Good. Okay, and you know, of course, then that functionally, to like calculate the total average you get at the end of the 6 weeks, 20 of your points come from academic practice and 80 come from great. I want to like state for the record that I got a 5 on BC calculus my senior year in high school. That was a really long time ago, and I can't remember none of it, but I was good at math once. So I just say that. Anyway, here we go. So here's how it works. Let's say that we have 3 academic practice grades. So I don't know, assignment A, assignment B, and assignment C. And let's say that you got 100 on assignment A, and 100 here, and like a 90 here. Right, so total, your like average to like figure out how many of these 20 points you got would be calculated by taking 290 and dividing it by 300, and that equals some number. I don't know what it is, don't even think that hard. But anyway, it equals some percent. And you multiply that percent times 20, and that's how many of those 20 points you would get. Is going to be like 19 or whatever. But here's the thing. You get 60 extra credit points for doing the storm video. Yeah, it's roughly 1 point per minute is kind of how we figured that out. The video is 1 hour long. And you get 60 extra credit points. So that would mean that you now have an average of 350 out of 300 points. Okay? That equals some percentage greater than 100. I don't know what it is. I can't think that fast. But let's pretend it was like 110%. It's not. But let's pretend. Okay? If it's 110%, then what is 110% of 20? Even I can do this. Oh, it's 22. 22. Okay, because 10% you need a little decimal, and then good. Okay, so that's 22. So now all of a sudden you have 22 out of 20 points. So it actually raises your 6 weeks average by 2 points. Does that make sense? So like, even though you might go, oh, that's just academic practice points, it's super lame, nobody cares. Particularly because we so often have, like, daily grades are typically like you just get 100 because you did it, that it actually tends to raise your average pretty significantly. So I strongly encourage you to do extra credit. Like, the point is I want you to have the grades you want in this class. You have to be willing to work for it, but that's kind of the idea. So there we go. Back to federalism. After that sort of sidebar with math in government class, which should never happen again. Okay, let's talk about the Constitution now. And the different kinds of powers. I'm going to take notes with you over here to give you a sense of how this all works. So we learned, apparently, at some point, maybe it was Monday, I guess, we learned about the name for powers of the national government. Do you remember what that was? Delegated powers is what I'm looking for. Delegated powers. And that refers to, and you can put this in your notes somewhere, that refers to all the powers of the national government. National government. Okay, but there are lots of other kinds of powers that the national government has that kind of go under the delegated umbrella, right? So we're going to draw, I'm going to draw an umbrella. Makes me happy. Oh, you can draw a little. I'm mostly waiting to have time to write. There we go. Okay, so under this delegated umbrella, there are several other kinds of powers. The first one I heard somebody say are the enumerated powers. The College Board sometimes calls them the expressed powers. They both mean the same thing, right? If I enumerate something or I express it, what am I doing? I'm telling it, I'm saying it, or I'm listing it. Enumerating means to list something. So these are the ones that are listed specifically in national government. The enumerated or expressed powers are the ones that are listed specifically in the Constitution. And while we're here, I think you should know that that comes in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 is where all of those enumerated powers are. If you were to flip to Article 1, Section 8 in your Constitution, you could give me a list of a couple of examples of some of those enumerated powers, like, okay, the power to regulate, I'm going to be really specific here, to regulate interstate commerce, that is between 2 or more states. Okay, what else? Post offices, a good one. Let's do one more example of an enumerated power. Coin money, great. So these are the enumerated or expressed powers, okay? They are not the only powers the national government has, but those are the ones that are listed in where? Article 1, Section 8. If you have your constitutions open, would you go ahead and title this page the enumerated or expressed powers? These are the enumerated or expressed powers. Article 1, Section 8. Full page. Article 1, Section 8. I have one more piece of information to blow your mind. This is not important for your government lives, but it just drives me a little bit crazy. This whole page, y'all, is one sentence. Just one sentence. Cue light bulb or something. Yes, just one sentence. There you go. But while we're here, I'd like to talk to you about that clause that we talked about regulating interstate commerce. It's the one in bold at the top in the middle. It's the one in bold. And this, I want you to write next to it the words Commerce Clause, because that's what they call it. It's called the Commerce Clause. I know how creative political scientists and historians are. The Commerce Clause. But underneath where you write the words Commerce Clause, I'd like you to write the words interstate commerce. I know that seems redundant, but the reason I didn't want you to call it the Interstate Commerce Clause is I don't want you to get confused when the AP test doesn't say the word interstate and you don't remember what it's supposed to be. So the Commerce Clause refers specifically to interstate commerce. And I bet you already know, but if you don't, we might jot it down here, that the Commerce Clause has been used throughout our country's history to expand the powers of the national government. Its job, or its purpose, what it's been used for, is to expand the powers. And so then, maybe back to your notes then. Hopefully you have a little bit more room than I do. Maybe back in your notes then, we're going to talk about a couple of cases that are important when we think about the Commerce Clause. The first one is Gibbons versus Ogden. Gibbons, Gibbons. Gibbons versus Ogden. Gibbons versus Ogden. This is an 1824 case, you don't even know that, and it was about steamboats. The state of New York had decided that they wanted to get some money, and the way they were going to do that was they were going to basically take bribes in order to grant a monopoly to one steamboat company, so that just one company would be allowed to trade stuff with steamboats in the port of New York. But there was a bunch of steamboat companies in New Jersey who were really mad because they thought that they ought to have the right to trade at the port of New York, because why would the state of New York be able to grant a monopoly? And they could go all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall, in the decision in Gibbons versus Ogden, said this: only the national government can control interstate commerce. He reaffirmed the Commerce Clause. The states have no power over interstate commerce. So in this case, New York could not grant a monopoly because the Port of New York is an access point for all different people from different kinds of states. And so the state of New York couldn't control that port. Only the national government could do that. That's Gibbons versus Ogden. The second case I want you to know about is the one that's the topic of your extra credit mini quiz. And in case it's not clear, the mini quiz is not a quiz. It's called that, which is confusing, but you just answer the question. The assignment is explained in Schoology. If you click on it, that's where you get the reading, and it will give you the explanation of what you're supposed to do. You're just going to physically handwrite the answers to those questions. You have a fair amount of detail in a tournament. That's what the mini quiz, how the mini quiz works. So anyway, the U.S. versus Lopez. This is a case in the 90s, and it dealt with a law whose name I can't remember that had to do with taking guns into school zones. Shootings a few school shootings had occurred, and the federal government wanted to really discourage people from taking guns into school zones. Obviously, it's a crime to actually use a gun in a school zone, but they didn't want people to have guns in school zones. So they passed this law that said you can't take guns into school zones, or it's a federal crime. And this guy, such and such, somebody Lopez, I don't remember, got prosecuted for having a gun in a school zone. And one of the things his lawyer did, as they're going through this case, is the lawyer challenges the constitutionality of the law. because this law is not constitutional. The national government doesn't have the authority. Where in the enumerated powers does it say anything about controlling guns in school zones? Hint, it doesn't. And the U.S. government responded like this. They said, well, here's the thing. If kids don't feel safe in school, they can't learn. If they don't get a good education, they won't be productive citizens. If they're not productive, then that's going to reduce the economic output of their state. And if the economic output of their state is reduced, then that will affect interstate commerce. Anybody buy? He's something. So the Supreme Court didn't buy it. We're giggling because it's a little bit crazy. The Supreme Court didn't buy it. And the outcome of U.S. v. Lopez, which you might want to jot down, the outcome of U.S. v. Lopez is that the Supreme Court said that there are limits to how far you can stretch the Commerce Clause. It's stretchy, but not that stretchy. To give an example of a stretch that was allowed, I'll tell you a story that my A-pushers have heard before. In 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, it required the integration or desegregation of all public accommodations. That includes not just government buildings, but also restaurants and bus stations and hotels and so on. And lots of, let's face it, racist people in the South were mad. They go, this is my private property and I can do whatever I want here. And if I don't want to let people of color in this room, I don't have to. And the federal government said, yes, you do, because if you're a public accommodation, if you're a restaurant or a hotel or whatever, you can reasonably expect that people would come into your establishment from other states, right? They're traveling, they're going to stop here. And therefore, you are a part of interstate commerce and we can regulate you. Well, this one spectacularly racist guy in Georgia decided that to make sure that he didn't have to integrate his business, he was going to post a sign and check IDs and only allow people from his state in his restaurant. And then on top of that, he was going to make sure that he only served things that he could source locally. So if he was going to serve fried chicken, he had to make sure he had a local supplier of chicken or whatever. And it worked a little while. The Justice Department had a kind of a hard time figuring out how they're going to get this guy, because when you're that racist, you just get who you got, you know? They tried to figure it out, and eventually they figured out that although he buys his ketchup packets or bottles or whatever it is from somebody local, somebody in the community, that they got the actual ketchup that they put in the bottles or packets or whatever from out of state, and that therefore he was participating in interstate commerce and was subject to the rules of the Civil Rights Act. And the courts agreed in that case. Although this guy was so racist that he decided to close his restaurant and go out of business rather than actually allow colors to mix.
Was it actually about ketchup?
Yes, it really was about ketchup, but I don't remember if it was bottles or packets. So there's that. Anyway, so those are two cases. So U.S. v. Lopez is an example about how far that it can't be stretched, but I think the Civil Rights Act shows that it can be stretched pretty far, right? We can take it pretty far. And then let's move on now and talk about the next big article, which creates a whole level of powers. So back to our notes here. We've got the enumerated powers, but then we have things called implied powers. And I know this is going to blow your mind. But the implied powers are the ones that are not listed, but they're implied. Oh, I go. And we get the source of those powers from something called the elastic clause, which is also sometimes called the necessary and proper clause. We get the implied powers from the elastic clause, sometimes called the necessary and proper clause. And you can find that in your green constitutions at the very bottom, all in bold, on Article 1, Section 8, same page. At the very bottom, all in bold, there it is. You might label it the elastic clause. I like to think about the elastic clause the same way you like to wear yoga pants after Thanksgiving dinner, you know, because they stretch a little bit, right? The elastic clause was designed to allow the Constitution to stretch a little bit. I'm going to give you a non-controversial example, and then we'll talk about controversial stuff. One of the enumerated powers is to create post offices and post roads, right? There it is at the end of the first box, to establish post offices and post roads. Now, nowhere in this list of powers does it say the national government has the authority to hire a contractor, does it? But if they have the authority to establish post roads, you might assume reasonably that they're going to have to hire a contractor to get that done, right? They're going to pay somebody to do that. It also doesn't say that they can establish rules about who can travel on post roads. But again, if you're going to build a road, it might make sense that you would be able to control who or how or whatever if people are traveling on that road. So the necessary and proper clause is supposed to say that look, we can do all the stuff on this list, right? All of those, what do you call them, powers? All of these enumerated powers, we can do all those things. And we can do anything else that is, wait for it, necessary and proper in order to do the things on the list. Okay, so we don't want the government to be, like hamstrung, that like they're supposed to do this thing, but it doesn't say they can also do this other thing, and so therefore they're like powerless. We don't want that to happen. So that's what necessary and proper clause is about. But it gets a little bit more controversial. Here we are. Our favorite Broadway musical star, Alexander Hamilton, had this plan to help shore up the nation's financial system, and he wanted us to create a national bank. He thought that would help us to make sure, to regulate commerce and to help control the money supply and stabilize, monetary policy of the U.S. So he wants us to have a national bank. Except for that, I challenge you to read the enumerated powers and find the words national bank in there. False, not there. Your job is done. It's not there. Nowhere in this list of powers does it say that we can create a national bank. And so some people were really gosh darn mad. Thomas Jefferson was furious. He goes, it is not necessary to create a bank. None of these things require a bank. It is not constitutional to create a bank. But George Washington liked Hamilton's plan. Hamilton eventually forced it through Congress. He didn't force it, he compromised. But anyway, gets it through Congress. But some people, including the state of Maryland, are really, really mad. So over here in the margin, or on your notes, wherever you prefer, I want you to write about the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch.
Is this implied power?
Yes, implied powers. It's part of that necessary and proper clause. The case of McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland. So in this case, the state of Maryland was really angry that one of the branches of this brand new national bank has been built in Maryland. And they don't like it. They think it's unconstitutional, they think it's problematic, they think it's not fair, and they just want to get rid of it. So they decide, they have a nefarious plan, they decide they're going to tax the bank. Because they figure they can raise taxes high enough to force the bank, this national bank, to collapse. And they make some money off of it in the end, so it's a win-win for them. But of course, the leader of the national bank didn't like this idea. That didn't seem fair to him. And so Mr. McCulloch, whoever he is, he sues. And it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the same guy, Chief Justice John Marshall, this is also in the 1820s, Chief Justice John Marshall, he looks at the case and he says, you know what? You might not like this, Maryland, but the bank is constitutional. So I wrote in my margin, I put, McCulloch versus Maryland equals bank is okay. He said, you know what? The bank is constitutional because look, the enumerated powers include the power to pay debts, the power to coin money, the power to tax. All of those things require gathering and holding and working with money. And it would make sense that the national government would need their own institution to do all of that, right? You can see how it might be problematic if the government had to always put federal money into state banks. That could be seen as favoritism, or could give some states more power than others, or whatever it is. We can see why that would not be a good plan. So John Marshall says in McCulloch versus Maryland that the bank is constitutional because of which clause? The elastic or the necessary and proper clause, right? He says that is a legitimate stretch of federal power. So we have the implied powers. Oh, one more, and I'm going to confess that this one I have a very tenuous grasp on. I have only one example, don't ask too many questions. It is called inherent powers. So this is still under that umbrella of the delegated powers, powers of the national government. Inherent powers. And inherent powers go like this. They're powers the national government has, not because they're listed, and not because we can imply them based on the listed powers, but just because the national government is a national government. To help you, let's talk about the word inherent. Somebody super neat, you just have to have everything just so, you don't want to admit to that. I used to be that way when I had children. Okay, Elena's willing to confess. So Elena is really neat. She likes to have things just so. She wants to have it just the way it is. Her things are all organized. Everything is going great. That's just, nobody had to teach her that. That wasn't something that somebody else has forced her to do. That is inherent to who Elena is, right? It's just who she is. We can't have Elena and not have somebody who's being neat. So in the same way, there are certain things, again, I still have one example. There are certain things that national governments can do just because they're a national government, right? Like, it wouldn't make sense for anybody else to have that power. My example is to control and gain territory. Right, so nowhere in the Constitution does it say the national government can gather, can get new territory. Can annex the rest of, the North American continent. It doesn't say that in the Constitution. But, I mean, who else would have that power besides the national government, right? We don't have to say the national government can gain more territory because obviously the states can't do that. They're part of the national, they can't take new territory and add new states to themselves. It doesn't make any sense. And it wouldn't make any sense to say that our government can't ever gather new territory. Why would we want to tell our government they can't have new territory? So that's an example of an inherent power. The power to take new territory and to govern it. It's just something the national government can do because it's a national government. It's not listed anywhere. But we just know that it can do that. So again, don't ask me any more questions. I literally have no more examples. I'm sure there are some. That's all I've got. But anyway, once that word appeared on an AP government exam, and so there we go, inherent powers. Okay. And then we've got reserved powers we're going to do later. Okay, this is just fun. Can you just look at my cartoon and appreciate it? He says, this is my supremacy clause. You get it, clause? Clause. Nobody gets it. You don't appreciate it. All right, this is what happens when you put together AP stuff in the middle of the night. Okay, would you please turn to Article 6 of your Green Constitutions? Article 6. Oh. Can you just look at this little guy's face? I mean, Article 6. Oh. Interesting. Because there's no more. Oh. Yeah. You just must not have picked it up on your way in. Yes. Yeah. I want to be something.
Take care of business.
Alright. So Article 6 here is the supremacy clause. The most important part is the part in bold. It says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be made in pursuance thereof. Clause, what the heck does that mean? The laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof. What's thereof? Thereof what? The Constitution. Okay, so the Constitution and any laws that are what? That are made based on what? The Constitution. So the Constitution and all federal laws that are constitutional. Right? So this doesn't apply if the government passes some law that's horrible and completely unconstitutional. But the Constitution and any laws that the federal government makes that are constitutional shall blah, 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 be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. And anything in the Constitution of any state, or the laws of any state, to the contrary, notwithstanding. What does that mean? If there's something in a state constitution or a state law that contradicts federal law that's constitutional, or the federal constitution, who wins? The national government, right? That's what this means. And so long as the federal government is obeying by the Constitution, then any law the national government passes wins, is supreme, comes out on top, if ever it comes into conflict with any state law or state constitution. That's what the supremacy clause is all about. And next to your supremacy clause piece in your Green Constitutions, I would like for you to add in another little note about McCulloch versus Maryland. What was the McCulloch versus Maryland case about? National Bank. Good. A little note about McCulloch versus Maryland. The other thing that John Marshall said in the McCulloch versus Maryland decision was that, oh yeah, by the way, Maryland, you can't tax the federal government because that would be giving the states the power to control or destroy the national government, and that is clearly contrary to what the supremacy clause says. So I wrote on mine, McCulloch versus Maryland equals states can't tax, parentheses, destroy U.S. federal government. So we'll make sure that you write somewhere here, McCulloch versus Maryland says that part of the supremacy clause also means the states can't tax the national government. Okay, we have talked about U.S. v. Lopez, talked about Gibbons versus Ogden. We talked about the Civil War, right? How the Civil War is going to expand the powers of the national government. So since I'm about to have to pass out those quizzes, the last thing I want you to do is in your notes, if you would just make a brief list. You've already explained these to yourselves. But if you just make a brief list, like, I don't know, you can call it growth of the national government or something. And you can list these big topics. Don't put U.S. v. Lopez, because did U.S. v. Lopez expand the powers of the U.S. government? It did not. It minusculely strengthened them, whatever. But you might list McCulloch, Gibbons, and then of course the Civil War. There on your papers.